Hello, everyone, and really sorry we're late. We have a bit of a technical problem, and we hope that Reem from Sudan will be able to join us. But I'm very happy that I'm here with Ahmed and Dilar for this panel today. So let me start, obviously, by thanking BuildPalestine and for also accepting to co-organize this panel with the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy, which I'm representing. And so before we start actually digging the conversations, we're asked to give you a bit of some details for logistics. So أول إشي الناس اللي محتاجين مترجمة بالعربي واللي بس أجوا على المؤتمر في ربط على الشات على الدردشة على اليمين. ففي كل التفاصيل على الصفحة وفي لينك زوم للترجمة. So this conversation will obviously happen in English, and yes, there is translation happening for our Arabic speakers. So for the audience, now, for those who have joined other sessions, and it was great discussions, that you can ask questions on the chat on the right, and the team will filter them to us. So during the Q&A session. This session is really about trying to learn from other activists and advocates and organizers from other social movements, political movements, to learn some lessons from them that could be really useful for us in the Palestinian context. For those who don't know me, my name is Ines Abdelrazek. I'm the Advocacy Director for the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy. I am Palestinian and French, and I'm based in Ramallah. And so I will, before I present our outstanding speakers that will discuss the topic, I wanted to give you a bit of an overview of, what do we want to be discussing today. I think no Palestinian doubts today that we really need to transform and reimagine our socio-political system, not only because the leaders in power are not representing us and should change, but also because the institutions, the economy, the factions, the religious and fragmented structures that we live under are interdependent to the colonial and apartheid system that control us. So it's not only dispossessing us from our past and present, as other speakers said earlier, but it's also making the future daunting a bit. The challenges in stake for having back our political agency and coming together to rethink our path forward is really, the stakes are really high and wide. So many of us really sometimes don't know where to start. And so one thing for sure is that we'll need successful organizing, coming together as a collective that can strategically overcome the multiple obstacles we face. And so, we have the opportunity today, and thank you so much for joining me, to get inspired from other movements that have really gone through or are going through radical change, and who have brought their people concretely into action to reimagine and create the future they believe in, one based on justice and freedom. So, we're hoping that Reem will join us, but I have two outstanding speakers here. Dr. Dilar Dirik is a Kurdish postdoctoral researcher, currently at the Refugee Studies Center of the University of Oxford. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Cambridge. And her upcoming book is called The Kurdish Women's Movement, A History, Theory, and Practice. We're also joined by Ahmed Abu Znaid. Ahmed is a Palestinian-American lawyer and organizer. He's the executive director of the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Ahmed co-founded the Florida-based Dream Defenders in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin, and has also long experience in organizing. So let's jump into it. Thank you really much again for joining us. And please, we hope that you'll have so many questions. I think this is really always helpful for us Palestinians to connect with other allies. So Dilar, I will start with you. it's hard to find in the world today a movement that captures best like radical imagining than the democratic experience in Rojava, which is the part of Kurdistan situated in northeast Syria. Kurdish women have a tradition of resistance. At the heart of it is the concept of self-defense based on social justice, communal ethics, with particular respect and attention to women's autonomy to fight the current system. So we want to learn more about the women's democratic confederalist system, as you call it. And so if you could tell us a bit more, from theory or to rather practice, because, here is also a summit for, getting us to action. So how did it come to actually exist? And, what did it take to go from your leader, Öcalan, inspiring thinking, to actually put into shape the Rojava movement and beyond. And obviously related question for us that are important, and we're often talking about central figures. How important is having a central figures like Öcalan for your people's mobilizing? And also what did it take from a feminist perspective to the construction of an alternative to the male-dominated militarist state nationalism? So it's a big questions, but please in 5 or 7 minutes, whatever you want to share with us, I think will be super useful.
Thank you so much, dear Ines. I'm very happy to be joining this panel, and congratulations for organizing such an amazing and important summit. This session is happening because one of the things that I really want to mention, and which is part of the Kurdish freedom movement's approach to diplomacy, is that actually the time of nation status diplomacy should be over. We live now in an age in which social movements, women's struggles, land defenders need to be reconnecting in a transnational manner. So panel is a very good example of that. Thank you so much for having me. I'll try my best, of course, to summarize the history and the practice of the movement in a few minutes. Of course, it's not possible to get into all of the details, but just maybe to frame the general logic that informs it. First of all, of course, the Kurdish struggle is really diverse, just similar to the history of the Palestinian. There are many different political parties, different ideologies, different constituencies, and also Kurdistan is divided into 4 different countries: Iraq, Turkey, Iran, and Syria. And in all of these, they have been historically oppressed. It's been very difficult for the Kurdish people to have a unified struggle, also because of the absence of, not always the presence of a common political project. So what I'm going to talk about specifically is what I call the Kurdish freedom movement, around the ideas of Abdullah Öcalan, and who is currently in prison, who has been in prison since 1999. Because he's the co-founder of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is internationally labeled as a terrorist organization. So in light of criminalization and occupation and violence from 4 different nation states, one being the 2nd largest NATO army, Turkey, it's difficult for the Kurdish people to find, putting aside the fact that it's been very difficult for them to make their concerns heard also internationally. So what the movement around is what he calls the radical democratic, ecological, and women's liberationist paradigm. And this is basically a non-statist approach to this happened after a period long discussions, and a lot of different struggles were happening at the time in the 1990s in Kurdistan, when the movement came to the realization that actually it is no longer a realizable thing to aspire towards the creation of a Kurdish nation state, because actually the nation state is
So I think Dilar's connection is a bit disconnecting. I'm not sure actually how to change the video setting.
At this stage.
So I'll just actually, Dilar, I think you're cutting. So I'll just present Reem, who just joined us. Hi, Reem. Thank you so much for joining. Sorry for the technicalities. I know it's, can be a bit of a difficult techie platform also for me. So we're joined by Reem, who's a Sudanese feminist writer, journalist, and researcher. She does communications and advocacy for Sudanese civil society organizations, and she's currently in the coordination committee of Sudanese women in civic and political groups known as Mansam. So I think Dilar's video seems still to be disconnecting. So maybe Ahmed, I'll turn to you now. And actually, so from your experience, with Dream Defenders and all of your experience in the U.S., really, I would like to understand a bit what does building power means concretely. Like, how do you build influence beyond sometimes small echo chamber of people who either are already engaged or talk to each other, are like-minded, and how do you also people feel like their struggles are interconnected, and kind of join in that collective. So if you could speak a bit about that experience, that would be also great, I think, for us.
Thank you, Ines. Thank you to BuildPalestine and all of the organizers, and of course to my co-panelists, Reem and Dilar. Can everyone hear me? Can you give me a nod if you hear me fine, Ines? Perfect. Okay, great. Yeah. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you all. I mean, for me as a Palestinian, first and foremost, it's just exciting to be connecting with other Palestinians. And I can say for many of us who grew up outside of Palestine, in the US or otherwise, we've had this yearning for always wanting to connect with our peoples, with our land. And so I always cherish these opportunities. So thank you. The question is a good one, and, there's no simple solution. But when we talk about building power, what we're really talking about here is putting resources, tools, and strategy at the hands of our community members, and what's also important when you're talking about this building of power is, of course, there are these institutions. There are these institutions that we build, and every, oppressed peoples or peoples that are struggling for justice have them. But there's such an importance to making sure that these institutions maintain their connection to the grassroots and the community. And oftentimes what we see is these institutions becoming more and more detached from the reality of the day-to-day of our peoples, the reality of the strategy and the decision-making and the thought process of our community members and our peoples. And so we want to make sure that, any institutions that we're building that are building power for us as a community are ultimately accountable to us as a community. And this isn't easy to accomplish. Every organization has to deal with, what the strategy, mission, and vision is for the organization, but also ultimately, who are you accountable to? And so for those of us in the United States of America that are Palestinian American, that are Palestinians seeking to figure out how we can impact building power in these United States of America, we have to be mindful again, with the vision, the strategy, the mission, but also who are we accountable to? And I think for us as being Palestinians in America, we're accountable to Palestinians back home and also Palestinians in America that have to live, under these regimes and under this current Trump regime. We have to be mindful of what that strategy looks like for us domestically and also internationally. So I wanted to lift that up. You talk about, how do we make sure people are interconnected or they see their struggles as interconnected? Well, I want to lift up Kimberly Crenshaw, a brilliant African-American academic here in the United States that actually coined the term intersectionality. And intersectionality was a term that she coined because Kimberly was attempting to break down for people the different impacts that a Black woman would be facing under such a abusive settler colonial state like the United States of America. And what she was attempting to point out to them is that her relationship to this system doesn't just begin and end with her Blackness. She's also a woman, right? And so, there's these different dynamics when you talk about intersectionality, you're talking about the whole human being. And so if someone is black and a woman and poor, you know, you're talking about now different intersectionalities of oppression and potential injustice, right? So for Black Americans in the United States, you know, this settler colonial state was founded on a genocide of the Native Americans, but also on anti-Blackness, right? And we have to recognize that. But also the US is incredibly patriarchal and misogynistic. A perfect example is our current president. And so we always have to be mindful of, again, what are the intersectional impacts? Because this Black woman coming to a space is not just representing a Black human being. They're representing the human experiences of someone who's a woman and someone who has different economic impacts. And so when I talk about, you know, bringing people together, I always like to look at the systems, you know, that are intentionally keeping us separated and divided, as opposed to looking at individuals. And I think it's fine. We can critique individuals and individual institutions. But I think for me, in order to address any root causes of injustice, we have to look at the systems. And so for us in the United States, one thing to grapple with right now is, why is it that poor white Americans are continuing to side with someone like a Donald Trump, when in reality, they probably have much more in common with people from the movement for Black Lives who are radically reimagining what the United States can be for its peoples, for its community members, right? When you talk about, instead of spending trillions and trillions on military weaponry and military bases all across the United States, and instead of investing and becoming a nation that thrives off of the commercial investment in genocide and death, you know, we can shift resources to be a United States that actually can decolonize certain structures and begin to repair the ills that were levied upon the native indigenous folks of this country. And similarly, we can begin to look at reparations and what that means for Black Americans in again, trying to make whole the wrongs of yesterday and the wrongs of today. And so when we talk about making people interconnected, we want people to understand that these systems are eating at all of us in different ways. And some people are privileged more so than others. But unless really you're a part of the 1%, you know, and usually a part of the white power structure, you're usually really a microcosm or maybe a chess piece on the chessboard. And so we want to make sure that people are understanding that we don't want to be played by the system. You know, we want to be able to play the system to the best of our abilities until we can abolish that system and create something that we actually, you know, have full faith in as communities. And it's, you know, for the Palestinian community, just like the Black American and the Native American community, we've had systems forced upon us, right? Malcolm X talked about, you know, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock, Plymouth Rock landed on us. And that's a similar experience for Palestinians. So we didn't, you know, seek out this oppressive system and travel somewhere. You know, this is something that has been forced upon us. And so, you know, we have to continue to imagine radically, envision radically, dream radically, until we know what system is going to work for us, until we abolish these systems of oppression that are currently before us, and we're able to, you know, see true fruition to a liberated Palestine. I will stop there in case there are any questions.
Yeah, we'll have time for questions, because I have a lot of questions already for you. And we have Dilar back, so that's great. Dilar, if you can, you know, we go back to the Kurdish movement, and if you can please, yeah, give a bit of your experience practically on this.
Sure. I'm really sorry for the internet connection. I really apologize. So I'll just saying, Kurdish struggle, because of its transnational, because it's low in a very strategic place, and because there is war and occupation happening in all different parts, the movement had a period actually in the 1990s. Realization came that the nation state, as it is, as the system of oppression that it represents, this monopoly on the use of violence, on ideology, basically the nation state as a colonizer of life. And I think Ahmed was saying something along those lines just now when I joined back again, is that it's a very unnatural system especially considering the social fabric of the Middle East. It's harmed the Palestinians, harmed the Kurds, and many other groups. So in this sense, nation state that would be led by male leaders who are often cherry-picked by international systems, or especially by Western countries, is not going to represent the people's interest. But at the same time, we shouldn't assume a very abstract idea of the people, but we need to build society from below. And this is why the Kurdish freedom movement, also drawing on Öcalan's ideas, we need to rethink who is the subject of the revolution, of the social revolution that we want to have in our societies, to have justice and to reclaim the means of justice making, the means of knowledge production. And for that reason, youth and women need to be the forerunners, the main subjects of this kind of process. So this is why in our there cannot be a single institution, a single sphere of the struggle that is without women. So that's one. Women have to have not just to say, they have to have equal participation and equal representation. But this is not something for granted, because oftentimes, especially in the Middle East, but in other parts of the global South as well, is explained in these very culturalistic ways, like this is just our culture can change. First of all, culture does change. It's our societies are made up of people, and say this is when we say society doesn't change, we actually men do not want society to change, but in fact young in the way they are. So in this sense, to re-enchant life, we need to build our institutions from below. So this includes economic cooperatives, it includes people, because when the neoliberalizing, knowledge is taken away from societies and sold or privatized, and this is also something that funds hierarchy in our societies. So we need public education works. We need, but more than anything else, we really need to find these grassroots democratic forms of relating to each other. So we one single party as a representative, we try to create movements. So we have Kurdish women's movements in different parts of Kurdistan, which they themselves are for women's communes and women's councils in a confederal way. And then we have a Kurdistan-wide women's movement, and also we have the women's movement in Europe. So we within our movement. So we try to, above all, democratize and decentralize, and to call this an approach to the Kurdish question that goes beyond a very small, almost primitive idea of in this like very nationalistic patriarchal sense. We say this is exactly the last few years the so-called Islamic State, so much reactionary and sectarian who are subjected to daily femicide. It is not our luxury to render our willpower to even people in our own party. This is why we say women's autonomy is necessary. What we mean that within our movements, women need to be able to organize and make their decisions autonomously. Men cannot interfere with them. There is a consultation, and women are also equally supposed to be part of structures, but in the autonomous sphere, there the women can come up with their own concepts, their own critiques, criticize each other away from that patriarchal gaze, so that when they are taking part in the mixed structures, they also feel more empowered, because women then represent willpower. So we have the system called co-presidency, which is implemented in all levels in Rojava, but also in Turkey, in the People's Democratic Party, for example. But what does the co-presidency system mean? It's not just to symbolically have an idea of equality, but actually the woman co-president, she only gets elected by the women's movement to make sure that she represents the women's movement's interest. And she's also in charge of democratizing counterpart. So we have mechanisms like this, and I don't want to keep going for too long about these technicalities, but the idea is, even within our own movements, we need to have radical democracy and autonomy as a principle, as an organizational principle, and this can slowly become a culture. But of course, as you may know, just today, 17 people who are doing exactly this kind of work, human rights defenders, politicians, feminist activists, were imprisoned in Turkey. Women in Rojava have been specifically targeted by Turkey's proxy forces that have invaded the region. So many of the gains of the women's movement are now under attack, which is why, as the Kurdish women's movement, we also say we need to make alliances in the Middle East with women's struggles in the Middle East, with our Palestinian sisters, and everywhere around the world, because we do not believe that we can have selected representatives to be, kind of speaking on our behalf. We need to form a new sociality for the Kurdish people, so that we are not just confined to one identity, but we can actually beautify our society, make it a more just society, even if we are under occupation and attack. And in this sense, of course, Öcalan's writings have been really important. And I think leadership in this way, in this confederal way, is more possible because we are not delegating. We're not just counting on some people to represent us, but we create so many different sides in our own movement for contestation, so that we can have a whole society in structure. So really, organization and struggle are the main principles of the Kurdish movement, I can say. But this cannot happen without women's ideological perspective and women's radical decision-making spheres of the struggle. So in this sense, I want to
thank you, Dilar, and it's a really fascinating system and really project that you have here. And I have so many questions, including and I hope we'll have time, but 45 minutes is really frustrating. I'm hoping we can actually share with all the audience some of the readings and the people you've mentioned that have really shaped how all this came together, including Öcalan and Ahmed also mentioned, about intersectionality, great American thinkers. I'm turning to Reem. Reem, are you here with us?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm here.
Great.
Can you hear me?
So, yeah, I would love to hear from you. We have 15 minutes left, so we'll have very few time for questions, unfortunately. But I want to say that Reem is really, thank you for joining us from Khartoum, where I know you're having so much internet issues, and infrastructure issues sometimes. So really grateful that you could make it, and I know you're very active in traveling. So Reem, we all watch really with so much interest and fascination what happened in Sudan, and is still happening in Sudan. From last year and the revolution that happened. So I really wanted to also for our Palestinian audience and our audience today to really learn more. How this eventually came together, how did the forces of freedom of change, forces of freedom and change came to come about? Was there a tipping point? And I know, all of this is also not from one day to the other. We see on TV huge demonstration and a revolution, but that's also on the base of a lot of organizing that happens before. So I really would like to hear from you on that, if you can.
Yeah. So I think, in Sudan, from day one, since the coup d'etat happened in 1989, people have been fighting through different ways, through different political coalitions and different civil society organizations. I think the most promising, kind of political movement happened in 2012, 2013. So we had mass protests around the country in 2012, and then we had a protest in 2013, mass protest for just a few days. So I think in about 3 days, more than 200 people were killed. So they were really, really, really big. So I think reflecting back as activists and as, working in different movements, we try to understand why did they fail? There were so many people on the streets. So why did the protest movements in 2012 and 13, why did they not materialize, and why did they not basically, lead to any real political change? So, just looking back, I think people started talking about the need to organize at the community level. okay? People were frustrated at the political parties. People felt that the political parties do not represent their agendas. And I think people began organizing at two levels. One, the community level. So we had the establishment and the organic kind of growth of something called the neighborhood-based resistance committees, Lijan al-Muqawama. So, you know, people started forming resistance committees in their neighborhoods. And of course, because it was a real, you know, it was a police state where everyone and their mother was in the security, right? So people didn't trust each other. So only like 3 to 5 people, maybe sometimes more, would come together and form a resistance committee. And they would all be like, you know, friends, or they grew up in the same neighborhood, so they know each other and they trust each other. And this was important because people had to work within their comfort zones. So you had different resistance committees, you know, in the same neighborhood, and people didn't really know each other, right? So the resistance committees was to basically do revolutionary work at the neighborhood level to inspire people and to make them know that there are others who feel the same way. There are others who want political change, like graffiti, for example, distributing flyers, you know, like doing different newsletters, doing different, you know, revolutionary acts. So 2013, I was involved with a youth movement, and we, you know, so I used to like distribute flyers in my neighborhood, for example. You know, we used to do this kind of work to make people feel that a lot of people feel the same way about the political situation. And then on the other hand, you also had the rise and kind of like development of, you know, professional unions or trade unions that were not basically part of the government trade union. So they were independent trade unions, like the teachers committee, you know, the doctors were coming together, lawyers were coming to, so different groups were coming together to establish or to really like strengthen the trade unions, the independent trade unions. So basically, when in 2018, when the you know, the protest started, you already had this infrastructure that you could basically depend on. And the infrastructure it took years to build. It took a lot of effort to build, okay? And it was built something like in a very, I wouldn't say discreet way, but it was built in a very organic way and really at the community level. So this is why, for example, you had different neighborhoods and even different like villages and towns taking part in the revolution. You know, I mean, even some places I've never heard about before, because people were building, activists were building this infrastructure over the years. So yeah, so basically, like you asked about the FFC, the Freedom and Change, you know, coalition. So when the protests began, of course, because in 2018 we had protests, but they were led by political parties, people were not very, like, I mean, they did not really like, they were kind of like aborted as quickly as when, you know, after the government started arresting political leaders. So in 2018, when the protests began organically by students in different parts in Sudan, a body calling itself the Sudanese Professionals Association had already planned to take like a memo to the parliament to say that you need to raise the minimum wage because it's just not enough. It was done based on the study that they did. So when they saw that people were out on the streets in Damazin, in Gadarif, in Adbara, in River Nile State, they were saying, oh no, people don't want, you know, to raise the minimum wage. They want political change. So basically the ambitions are much higher. So this is why the SPA basically appeared as the leader of the revolution, and they were the ones telling people to protest. They were the ones basically planning, announcing protest movements and so on. The Freedom and Change Coalition, it came about as a kind of a coalition that brings together civil society, political parties, the trade unions, all the different bodies that work to basically you know, to basically realize this moment, you know. So so yeah, so so just like it's an infrastructure that took a while.
Yeah, I think that's a really important message, that, you know, this is really taking a lot of efforts, years, and I really hear you all from the fact that it's come from the communities to building power together through, you know, the communities coming together and being organized from the grassroots. I think the one big question, because we only have 5 minutes, and I think all of you could chip in, is really given that, you know, the importance of community building and building trust within the communities themselves, and making sure that those who are marginalized and often silenced, whether it's women or farmers or else, are really part, and this is their struggle, you know. So how do you play around the differentiated powers within society, and in a sense, like, how do you you know, first fight against the resistance that you probably have from patriarchal structures, from security apparatus, from the state? So how do you resist that? And I think often a big elephant in the room is ego. You know, ego in movements. Like, how do you actually fight? And ego is also inherited from patriarchal structures, but you know, it's how do you actually fight against these forces that eventually can lead to cooptation by certain groups or by certain elites that have also privilege. Look here, you know, we as Palestinians here, as a Palestinian, I have some privilege that other Palestinians don't. And so I think all of us should be really conscious of this. And so how do you fight against this? So maybe Dilar, if you wanna start.
Sure. I'll be quick. Basically, it's an ongoing struggle, of course, to always ensure that the movements are as broad-based as possible. But I think here the question of leadership comes in again, because yes, we have societies, communities with different access to resources, education, and information, and being heard. So this is why the concept of something like being a forerunner, being somebody who opens a path for other people. This is something very important in our concept, in our movement. Not only we have accountability structures to many different places. So, for example, an elected woman or somebody who is in a position, she's not just accountable to people who are maintaining that space, but she's actually accountable to the women's movement. And the women's movement itself consists of assemblies of the peace mothers, assembly, and so on. So these assembly structures seem all very secretive to people watching from outside, but in fact what's happening is that we have within our movement spaces of criticism, and because the ideology of Öcalan is fundamentally based also on analyzing power and its relationship to liberalism as well. I think a lot of the problems with elitism also come from ideologies, the NGOization of struggles. So we need to bring back this very revolutionary, grassroots oriented, but progressive. So grassroots does not mean that we have to take steps back. Being grassroots radical means that believing that women can be free in Palestine and in Sudan and in Kurdistan. This is not a luxury, that it's not a Western import to demand liberation of women. In a region where women were, both in Africa and in the Middle East, there's a 5,000 to 6,000 older history of women's leadership. This is why our perspective on history is also important, to get rid of ourselves from patriarchy and the state. Actually, we are society. We are all what Öcalan calls the forces of democratic modernity. And by that, we mean all social movements, no matter what they may call themselves, whether feminist, national liberationist, anti-colonial. We believe that there is a system that we're up against, and it's a capitalist system. It's a nation-state system, and it's a patriarchal system. So this is why I think building alliances is really important also to maintain.
Well, guys, I wish we could go all night, you know, and like smoking argile or whatever you drink, cola or whatever. Ahmed, please, like, tell us a bit about this issue of resisting cooptation and egos, and either from within or actually from outside, like, and tips also, like, for us.
First of all, big ups to everything Dilar said. So there's no need to go ahead and repeat that. But I think ultimately what you're talking about is if these structures don't work for us, we have to reimagine what structures will and build those structures. And so when you're talking about, you know, how to build your broad base and building your community in a way that's accountable, you have to lead with values. And what are those values and ideals that you want to emphasize in the building of your culture and the creation of, you know, the environment that you're building? And so that's why I really love, you know, when Dilar talks about, you know, the analysis of power as being a central theme for their movement, you know, because what are we grappling with beyond the occupation? You know, what are we grappling with beyond the wall and the checkpoints? What is it really that we'd like to see Palestine look like? And so then we have to really be committed to those ideals and values. And I think we have some of those figured out, but we have a lot of work to do, especially, you know, as was previously referenced around the issue of patriarchy. This is something that, you know, at all levels of every culture and every society, like Western society, leadership structure has impacted us here. And so, you know, you support really values-based, values-rooted movements that are led by folks like Dilar and otherwise, that are folks that are doing the hard work, the work to be accountable to their communities, so that they can actually confidently say they're speaking for their communities when they're making these statements. So I'll pause there because I know Reem also needs to get in, but I just wanted to touch on, I'm sorry, someone asked the question about the balance between grassroots and policy, and really you have to have a balance. You have to be active in both. And it may be that not this institution, for instance, USCPR may not need to be active in both, but as a grassroots movement, we've worked hard so that we can see a Rashida Tlaib in the US Congress supporting BDS, supporting, you know, liberation struggles for Palestinians. That is a direct result of grassroots organizing and movement and power building over the last few decades. I'll pause there. Thank you very much for this.
Yes, I think.
Thank you so much, Reem.
So
Go ahead, Jim.
Basically, one of them is that, I mean, during the different revolutionary struggles, every time you bring up, you know, women's issues, you bring up like gender equality as one of the aims, right? We're always told that no, when the government changes, when there's political change, automatically by default everything is going to change, which we know is never going to happen. So we're kind of silenced that right now it's time to do the more important work, which is basically to break down the dictatorship, which is. But I think for us, I mean, and we just knew from the beginning we were not going as women, even though we were the backbone of. Even though we were on the front lines from day one, even though we were actually the majority in the protest movement, right? We just knew that we were not going to see any real changes because the whole structure is very deformed, whether it's the opposition, the former government, the state, Sudan as a state in general, it's very much deformed. And there are a lot of pillars basically that are supporting the patriarchy, from laws to, you know, traditions and norms, and the native administration or the tribal leaders. You have so many different institutions and political interests that are supporting this oppression against women, against, you know, minority groups, against religious minorities, against all different groups, right? So I think, but I think one of the things is, and I'm sure, you know, you have been realizing this just in your own struggles, is that knowing how to fight is something, but knowing how to build, and this is something you spoke about, Ahmed, is something else, right? And we know how to fight because we've always been fighting, right? But when it comes down to like building a system, like working to build power from within, from the community level, and working to actually change or to break down all the systems of oppression, right? This is really a big challenge in Sudan, especially when the systems of oppression are not affecting everyone, and everyone at the end of the day is looking for their own interests, you know? So right now, we, as women, we do feel that if we do not have serious reforms that are like during this transitional period, the situation for women in Sudan is not going to change. So we are fighting like I'm not going to say every day, it's like every minute basically, because this for us is it, you know, this is what we have been working towards our whole lives.
Thank you so much, Reem. And actually about building, so we only have 1.5 minutes left. Yeah, there is no clapping on this platform, but I would love to have you. In this 1:30, please, we ask everyone to actually talk about how they radically imagine Palestine. Obviously, in your case, we asked that to Palestinians. I would actually love, just please in 15 seconds, what is the one thing in few words that you think is really key to actually the success of that building? Like, how do you make it a success from theory and discussions in the salon and on the streets and in your neighborhood to building power and building that revolutionary power? Please, Reem, because you ended, so you can.
Yes, I mean, I think it's, I think we're just kind of, we're trying to figure out how to do it right now, right? Because I think, like, I mean, after the fall of the, you know, the Bashir regime, I think a lot of people realized that the easier part of the process, you know, is over, and that right now we're facing the more difficult part. So I think right now, this is why we're facing very serious polarization in Sudan when it comes to like political polarization. We're facing like different groups splitting up. We're facing a very difficult, you know, political environment to work in. We are facing a lot of, we're just facing a very difficult environment right now, okay? And I think there's a kind of, not a breakdown, but the revolutionary infrastructure is getting really challenged, right? And part of me really believes that this is not always a bad thing, right? Because this is a time where people really have to figure out what are the values that we've been fighting for? What do we want to keep, and how do we want to move forward, right? And anyone who is there just for, you know, offices, anyone who's there to get a piece of the cake, anyone who's there not to actually, you know, put pressure to have real radical change, you know, we don't have to work together, basically, right? Because this is the time to have this kind of radical change. So I think all this polarization and the problems and the splintering and all the bad news that we keep hearing every day is not necessarily, you know, a bad thing, if I may say.
Ahmed, 10 seconds. It's really challenging, but we really have to.
We need unity amongst our people. We're divided regionally, you know, economically, but there is also a strength in being so spread out. So I would love to figure out how we unify the diaspora with the people on the ground, with the people in the camps, everywhere, united.
Dilar, we'll end with you.
Thank you. Well, I'll just say the slogan of the Kurdish women's movement in Arabic, it's Jinjian Azadi in Kurdish. In Arabic is Mar'a, Hayat, Hurriya. And this is women, life, freedom. And I think defending these at all costs, making sure they can express themselves in their fullest being, and not have any obstacles to the full realization in the universe. I think this is something that can resonate with many freedom-loving and marginalized and oppressed peoples around the world. And so I just think we can radically imagine, the more we get in touch with each other, the more we learn from each other.
Thank you so much, everyone. Like, it was really fascinating, and I hope offline and everyone can really take a lot of these conversations and connect to continue the conversations. There will be a video at the end of this panel to showcase really a change maker on the ground in Palestine related to the topic of this panel. So thank you so much, and stay on for the next people. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Much.
شكرا.
مع السلامة.
مع السلامة. شكرا.
Thank you.